Good afternoon to all of you. It's great to see so many alums here. I am Francisco Herrera, or for those of you who have some facility with the language, Francisco Herrera. I'm the chairman of the Alumni Executive Council, which is a group of alums who are foolish enough to spend their own money to come here a couple of times a year in order to work on some very, we think, important subjects. I am fortunate to be the chair, which for the most part means that I have the responsibility of watching the clock and making sure that our jam-packed agendas proceed on time. No easy matter. But I also have the privilege of working with a group of very bright, very talented, and very responsible individuals who make up the rest of the Executive Council. As I looked at the topic that had been selected for this afternoon, it occurred to me, wouldn't it be terrific to talk about the revitalization of the Kennedy School of Government, the challenge for the 21st century? And as I thought about that, I thought about the work that we do with our Executive Council. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, we spend our 2 or 3 days here on campus dealing with a whole number of issues. We try to assist with fundraising. We meet with faculty and staff and students, look at some of the issues that are on their minds, try to get a pulse for the school, look at some problems, see if we can help with the solution of some of those problems in the areas of curriculum development, professional development, diversity, big issue on everybody's mind. And so, in our own small way, we are trying to be agents of change, if you will. We are trying in our own way to help the continuing revitalization of this school, which we like. And when we do so, we come at it from very different perspectives. We have graduates who left this school more than 10 years ago, some more recently. But all of us appreciate that the world out there, outside these doors, changes all the time. The world is becoming more and more diverse. And that's why it seems so appropriate to me that the title for all of the things we are doing here in the Refresher Weekend would be Managing in a Changing and Diverse World. The world around us will continue to change. It'll become more and more diverse. And as it does so, I ask myself, and I'm sure many of my colleagues on the Executive Council also ask themselves, what is the Kennedy School of Government going to be like in the 21st century? What will the composition of the staff, the administration, the faculty, the students, the curriculum, what's it going to look like in the 21st century? I don't know the answers to those questions. Those are challenging thoughts. But I have a hunch that as we listen to some remarks about the challenge of democracy, that we will see some linkage between the challenge of revitalizing democracy and the need to continually revitalize our own school. And so with that, I present to you Dean Bob Putnam.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Francisco. I know that I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have all of you back. The arrival of the alumni for Alumni Weekend every year is a wonderful, rejuvenating event for the Kennedy School. Partly because it usually signals the arrival of spring in Massachusetts, partly because your return reminds us vividly of what this school is about, what our mission is, and of the need to be sure that we're constantly in touch with the profession that this school is meant to serve. So I want to say, first of all, thank you all for coming back. I also want to say thanks, in part on your behalf, to Francisco Herrera and the other members of the Alumni Executive Council. They work very hard on your behalf and on our behalf, and in particular, Francisco is doing a splendid job as chair of that group. Why don't you join me in expressing appreciation to him? There are a lot of people that deserve thanks for all that's gone into this weekend. Hard work in the alumni office and in all the other parts of the school, the executive programs and the degree programs and the faculty and the staff of this place. But there is one person who symbolizes the effort that's gone in to this weekend and the care and thought. And I know you also will want to join me in expressing special appreciation to Nancy Dietz. Nancy, are you here? Well, last year, I spoke with you all about the state of the Kennedy School as I saw it. Last year also, my vision was a little better than it is this year. I hope you'll forgive me if I add reading glasses. I talked with you about the mission of the Kennedy School, new ideas, and the leaders that can make those ideas work. I talked with you about some of the themes that the school was addressing: diversity and values and internationalization. And I want now this afternoon to talk about a single theme, but a theme that in a certain sense encompasses all of those themes. That is the theme of democracy, of American democracy, and about the need and the prospects for revitalizing it. Some of the early announcements of this talk described it as a blueprint for the 21st century. I thought that was a little much, and I hope you're not really expecting a blueprint, and certainly not for the whole of the 21st century. But I do mean to pose some questions and some of the challenges that I think do stand before us as we look forward to the coming century. In the 12 months since we last met, a lot has happened with respect to the prospects for democracy in the world. The revolutions of 1989 and their aftermath have brought an extraordinary sense of optimism and promise, and yet also a sense of the challenges and difficulties that are involved in bringing democracy to places that have not known it. The wave of democratic reforms that swept over Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and then Latin America and even Southern Africa, that wave was an enormous inspiration to those of us in the West. The appeal of the ideal of self-government proved stronger than the most overweening totalitarian regime. It reminded me, and probably reminded you, of that scene from Beethoven's opera Fidelio at the end of the first act, when there's the prisoners are coming out of the dungeon. You may remember that, and there's this tremendous upwelling, this soaring music, optimism, sense of liberation, and it's only the end of the first act. And of course, what comes after is more complicated than that. And that's actually also true of 1989-90. What comes after the first act is tougher. It's a privilege to live in a time when the ideals of self-government, of individual freedom and of equality, respect for the individual, respect for diversity, seem to be triumphant in countries where for a long time we had thought, in our ignorance, that those ideals had been extinguished. And over these last 12 months, the Kennedy School has been active in trying to take part in, contribute to that process of practical problem solving in the aftermath of the democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and also in parts of the Third World. Projects led by Graham Allison and Shirley Williams and Bill Hogan and others are carrying the techniques of public policy and public management, practical problem solving, to Moscow and to Leningrad and to Gdansk and to the Baltics. And more recently, indeed just a few weeks ago, a delegation led by Dutch Leonard and Pete Zimmerman were in South Africa talking with leaders of all of the various parties and factions. Indeed, they met somewhat unexpectedly, met with Nelson Mandela and talked about ways in which the Kennedy School could contribute to the process of democratization and the creation of a new democratic leadership in South Africa. So there's plenty for us to do in trying to help the process of democratization in the rest of the world. And yet, back here in the United States, where democratic ideals were first enacted in the U.S. Constitution more than 2 centuries ago, there's been a strong feeling that something's gone awry. There's a strong feeling that as we enter the 3rd century of this experiment, the experiment may be faltering. Voter apathy, cynicism, anger, and an array of social and environmental and economic problems that frustrates the will and the imagination and the leadership of elected representatives and of policymakers. How ironic it is that just at the moment, the apparently triumphant moment of liberal democracy in other parts of the world, there's questioning here at home about whether our democracy is living up to our own standards. Let me say at the outset that in my view, this discontent is not, for the most part, due to a lack of character or a lack of energy or to even a lack of inspiration on the part of our elected officials or public servants. In my view, the problem is not in the character or the skills and strength of the men and women who are devoting their lives to public service, who indeed most of whom are sacrificing private gain for public service. And nor, I want to stress this at the outset, nor is the verdict uniform on American democracy. Some things are working. Some things that all of you know about are working. Some things are working well, some things are working poorly. I think many of us were reminded of this looking at the performance of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Persian Gulf, both during and in some respects even more strikingly after the hostilities there. I think we can't help but be struck by the kinds of values that our military officers and men and women are carrying to the process of reconstruction. You will remember the motto from Burt Lance, I think's motto, from Washington: "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Some of you will also remember the Roger Porter's corollary: "If you don't know how to fix it, don't break it." But I think that one lesson that I take from there's now a small industry of deriving lessons from the Persian Gulf, but one of the lessons I take from the Persian Gulf, specifically about the performance of one of the parts of the U.S. government, the U.S. military, is that if it is broke, you can fix it. I think that's the lesson if you compare the performance and the evaluation both by the military and by civilian people in the Pentagon and by the rest of the country, the evaluation of the performance of the military in the 70s and then through the 70s, and then compare that to the performance of the military in the Persian Gulf, a sense that investment in people and investment of resources in an institution, training, good management techniques, and institutional redesign, I'm thinking here of Goldwater Nichols, can actually make a difference in the effectiveness of a government institution. So there are parts of the U.S. Political system that are working, and there are parts that aren't working, and yet I think what we can't avoid recognizing is that, and particularly those of us who are in the business of public service, have to look frankly at the state of American democracy and say, there are some serious problems currently afflicting our government. In any democracy, the strength and the legitimacy of the government rests on the consent of the governed, but mounting numbers of Americans feel alienated from the operations of our government. Polls confirm the lessons of any cocktail conversation that you've been involved in. Levels of distrust in our public institutions are now, in the last year or so, are higher than ever been recorded in the history of polling. We're accustomed to thinking about the 1960s as a period of alienation. But in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, when you ask people in America, do you trust government to do what's right? Most people, most of the time in the 1950s and 1960s said yes. If you pose the same question in the 1990s to people, do you think government's doing what's right? Most people, most of the time, say no. Meanwhile, voter participation in the United States has been in decline for nearly a century. In last November's elections, a meager 36% of all the eligible voters turned out. And in the United States now ranks last among all industrialized countries in the level of participation in elections. And worse still, America's youth are increasingly disengaged from the process of politics. In 1972, half of the nation's young people voted in elections. In 1988, the last presidential election, less than 1 in 3 of America's young people voted in the election. And America's young people today know less and care less about politics than previous generations did. That's, of course, not true for the younger generation that's represented in this school. But if you look at across the country as a whole, that is true. And for example, in 1965, 2 out of 3 Americans under the age of 35 read a daily newspaper, 2 out of 3. But today, barely 25% of Americans under the age of 35 read a daily newspaper. Well, now you'll say, sure, that's right, Dean, but you're picking your evidence. You're forgetting about the fact that people now watch television. Well, in 1965, over half of our young people watched the nightly news on television. And today that figure has dropped by over 20%. The network news shows now draw less than the audience of Roseanne or the Cosby Show. Now, it's hard to blame people for tuning out. The backlog of domestic issues has really become daunting. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's cocaine use. Why is that? American cities, European cities work. American cities don't. Vast neighborhoods have been simply abandoned to crime. Why? Why is that? We're increasingly adrift in an internationally very competitive economy. The Japanese invest more than 3 times as much in plant and equipment as we do. Why is that? Our students rank last in science and mathematics and first in illiteracy among the industrialized nations. Why is that? The savings and loan crisis, which had been festering for years, didn't come to public attention until just after the 1988 election. Why is that? Why didn't anybody have an incentive to raise that to the national debate? It took a reckless tyrant in the Persian Gulf to put energy back on the national agenda, and his defeat now seems to be taking it off the national agenda again. Why are we so short-sighted as that? And most basic of all, why are we unable to balance our national books? The federal budget deficits and the budget deficits in the states reflect our inability to make choices. So we simply borrow and we pass the bill on to our children. How did we get into this kind of pickle? These questions, I think, all demand that a school of government and people in public service think hard about it, address carefully. I think there are some common threads. First of all, it's our shared problems that are being neglected, the problems we have in common. Individually, we're doing fine. Levels of individual income are up. In many respects, personal behavior in the United States is now freer than ever in our history. There are, of course, large portions of the American population that have been left out of that increase in well-being and in individual liberty. But what's distinctive is it's the problems that we share that we're ignoring, that we've neglected, that we've been unable to address. Narrow parochial interests command greater attention now than do the broader national interests or the community interests. And our government, which is us, seems unable to act with foresight. So I believe that American democracy is in trouble. and we do need to think about how to fix it. At the school this fall, we began a major effort to try to understand what's working and what's not working in American government, and how we could address in a practical way the problems and what solutions we might find to the underlying problems that have given rise to this set of difficulties. We brought together people from policy analysis and people from public management, political scientists and policymakers and economists and political philosophers and practicing politicians and journalists and lawyers and teachers and experts from across this university and beyond. We've been trying to start with first principles. We'd like to spark a national dialogue on revitalizing American democracy. And my purpose this afternoon is with you, our alumni, to try to engage you also in that dialogue. What's working? What's not working? How can we fix it? Now, most of the current discussion in the popular press begins with cures or with supposed cures. There's much discussion, for example, about voter registration drives. And I think voter registration drives may just be a fine thing. But I think low voter turnout, well, it's a little bit like a fever in a child. If your child has a fever, you want to get the fever down, so you take aspirin to get the fever down quickly. But the fever is telling you that there's something else wrong in the body. And low voter turnout is in itself not nearly so important as a fact as it is as a symptom of something else that's not working in the society. So it seems to me that voter registration drives may be a good thing in themselves, but we ought not to think that simply getting people back into the polls is all that we need to do. And some of the supposed cures that are being talked about in the press as people focus on this question of American democracy, like term limitations for elected officials, for example, seem to me at least likely to make things worse rather than better. Term limitations, it seems to me, will have adverse consequences for the incentives facing elected officials, and in fact they will also tend to shift power to other actors, unelected actors in the political system, relatively speaking, increasing the power of lobbyists and of unelected officials. There's an interesting study to be done in California, for example, or in Colorado or Oklahoma, any of these other states where term limitations, term caps have been put into effect, to see what effect they have. I'm open, as any of us should be, to the possibility that it will have beneficent effects, favorable effects. But my strong expectation is that term limits will make things, term caps will make things worse rather than better. So our discussions here at the school have been predicated on the notion that rather than beginning with some supposed cures, some nostrums, we should try to understand more basically what's going wrong underneath, and then turn to the question of what can be done about it. So what's the problem? What are the trends that seem to have afflicted American democracy? And I want to put now some questions to you, not conclusions. This is the early stages of a discussion that I hope we'll all engage in. We have some suspicions about what things might not be working well, and I want to share some of our initial hypotheses with you. And I want to begin with the global context. On any political map of the world today, the boundaries between countries are just as marked as ever they were. But suppose instead of having a political map, you had a map in which reflected the flows of goods and services and capital and people, you'd see that national boundaries over large portions of the world are simply disappearing. Goods are flowing back and forth, people are flowing back and forth, in effect without regard to national boundaries. Global countries in Europe or in America or in East Asia develop and produce and market their goods in various markets, essentially without regard to the political jurisdictions in which they're operating. They raise their capital, they invest, they plan their strategies with the national boundaries being at best a kind of minor inconvenience. Global market integration has created unprecedented world prosperity. Countries that have tried to opt out of global markets, that have tried to follow economic autarky, economic isolationism, like, for example, the Soviet Union, have done so at their own peril. On the other hand, this global integration, interdependence, has also created a severe dilemma for governments, and especially for democratic governments. The openness of economies means that the policy levers that are available to officials no longer work the way they used to. In economic terms, for example, it used to be that if you wanted to speed up the economy, you'd step on the fiscal accelerator, and if you wanted to slow it down, you'd step on the fiscal brakes, or the monetary brakes. But now, with the global integration of global financial markets, if you step on the accelerator, it's the car next door in the next lane that goes faster. And if you step on the brakes, it may be the car beside you or behind you, or in front of you, worse yet, that stops. There's a good chance that this recession that we're in now will last longer than people had been expecting, but not because of anything that our policymakers are doing, but rather because of the policy that's being made, as it happens now, in the Federal Republic, in Germany, or in Tokyo. And what that means is that the political fate of congressmen in Youngstown or in Detroit are dependent upon decisions that are being taken in Yokohama or in Frankfurt. And, of course, interdependence is reciprocal, so that the political fate and the problematic situations that are facing leaders in other countries are affected by decisions taken in this country. In short, our markets have become increasingly international, and our polities, our governments, remain obdurately national or parochial, even local. We've traditionally thought of international relations between countries. There's a kind of a metaphor that's been used sometimes by historians or political scientists of a chessboard. You imagine two leaders sitting on opposite sides of the chessboard playing this game of international economic diplomacy or of military diplomacy. But the character of interdependence means that the game is more complicated now. I sometimes like to think of it as what I call a two-level game. Think of the leaders sitting around the table, Chancellor Kohl and Prime Minister Major and President Mitterrand and President Bush, each playing this international diplomatic game, or President Salinas, for example, who's going to be another alumnus of the school, is going to be visiting here next week, sitting on that side of the table, negotiating with President Bush on this side of the table about the U.S.-Mexican trade agreement. But behind each of the leaders, behind Major and behind Mitterrand and behind Kohl and behind Bush, is another table on which they're playing a different game with a different set of players. And around the table behind Bush are the various wings of the Republican Party and the Democrats on the Hill and all of the various groups that make up the pluralistic polity of this country. And similarly, behind Kohl, there are the leaders of the Social Democratic Party and the leaders of the Free Democrats and Foreign Minister Genscher and so on. And Kohl is playing a game back there at the same time that he's trying to play the chessboard in front of him. Now, the trick about this two-level game is that the moves you make on those two boards have to be consistent. If President Salinas wants to make a free market move on the table in front of him in his negotiations with President Bush, he's got to make the same move on the table behind him. And it may fit the table behind him, but not the table in front of him, or vice versa. This is a very complicated new world that we're in which all of these various game tables, which is another way of saying the politics in all of these various countries, are very entangled. Because you see, there can be some perturbation at the game table in the United States. Say that the environmentalists get upset about tuna. And that affects the stance of the American government with respect to Mexican tuna fishing. And that affects the opportunities, the strategic opportunities that are available to President Salinas. And that in turn has implications for the play on the table behind him in terms of his domestic interests. Well, often in this kind of two-level game, everybody would be better off if you could strike a deal at the international table, but the deal may not be ratified at the domestic table. In short, one important change in the world over the last few decades has been a growing mismatch between the geography of economics, the geography of our problems, and the geography of our problem-solving capability. The geography of our governments remains parochial, and the geography of our problems has become international. We identify with smaller communities. We identify with our homes, our communities. But the problems spill across these boundaries increasingly. Pollution, drugs, and all sorts of other opportunities, economic opportunities. And that mismatch, is that mismatch between the geography of our problems and the geography of our problem-solving capabilities, is that part of the problem? Is that one of the reasons why our government isn't working as well as we'd like? And if so, what could be done about it? Well, that's the first set of questions. A second set of changes that might be relevant to our predicament have to do with the institutions of American government. For example, in recent decades, the two branches of our federal government have been controlled by different political parties, whereas in the first half of this century, for the most part, one party at a time controlled both the presidency and Congress. From 1900 to 1952, the first half of the century, 1900 to 1952, we had 44 years of unified government. Same party controlled Congress and the presidency. In other words, in that period, only 15% of the time were the rivalries of party superimposed upon the rivalries of the branches. Since 1952, however, we've had divided government more than two-thirds of the time. 15% of the time in the first half of the century, 68%, 70% in the second half of the century. And moreover, that same trend toward divided government, legislatures in the hands of one party and the executive branch in the hands of another party, that same trend is true at the level of the states. So it's not to be explained simply in terms of the particular vicissitudes of the national parties, the fact that the Democrats can't find a strong candidate for president or that the Republicans can't rally the troops in congressional elections. There's something going on nationwide that has caused there to be greater partisan conflict between the branches of government. Now, what that represents, of course, mostly is individual voters splitting their ticket. Many individual voters voting for one party for their legislator or congressman and one party for the president or governor. And in that sense, divided government represents the people's choice. People actually chose that. But it's fair to ask whether that change is part of the cause of the gridlock that we feel, whether that new pattern of preferences fits so neatly into the institutions that we've inherited from the past. Our institutions have also changed in other ways that may be relevant. For example, in 1952, in the 1950s, I mean, when the Democrats controlled Congress and the Republicans controlled the presidency, Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson and Dwight Eisenhower would sit in the Oval Office with what Lyndon Johnson called bourbon and branch water, and if they made a deal in the Oval Office, they could make it stick. The pressures of partisanship would be overcome by the sense of collaboration to achieve public purposes. But more recently, first of all, there's been a growth of what Dick Neustadt calls we-theyism, a greater sense of antipathy between different participants in the political process. And beyond that, in the name of greater democracy, in the wake of the Watergate scandals, power within Congress has been fragmented and subfragmented and dispersed to committees and then to subcommittees and then to subcommittee staffers. New networks, very complicated networks of influence have evolved. What some people call iron triangles involving individual legislators and agency officials, subcommittee staffers, and single issue lobbyists, often strengthened by the power of political action committees. The savings and loan, the Keating Five, is a particularly unsavory example of how the system works. But in innumerable other cases that don't involve actually unethical behavior, our nation's business is increasingly transacted through these kinds of networks. One alumnus who was here at the school with a group of alumni a couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about this issue, said to me, this is a person who had served for 5 years on one of the staff, as a staff member on the Hill and has recently left. He said that there are people who are sick at heart each night because of the sense of daily malpractice on the Hill. Not illegal behavior, but not good professional practice. Now, this kind of system has certain advantages. As Ash Carter said in one of our Saturday sessions, you can hot wire this system. You can hot wire this system if you know how to do it. And of course, many of you, we know how to do it. One disadvantage is that not all Americans know equally well how to hot wire the system to make it work. Harvard, for example, research universities like Harvard can hire lobbyists who understand our interests and who can work closely and effectively and perfectly legally with people who deal with the issues of interest to Harvard. The American Association for Retired Persons is probably the most powerful single lobby in the United States. So I don't mean, I'm using examples like the American Association of Retired People and Harvard to indicate that even people on white horses, with even the good guys, are involved in this kind of responsiveness. Now, it is a responsive government. So the issue is not responsive, unresponsive. It's responsive how? It's responsive to what kinds of interests? And my question, our hypothesis is this an important change? This set of changes in the way our institutions, both nationally and at the state and local level, work? And is it, in some sense, shortchanging certain interests, broader interests, at the expense of other interests, narrower interests? Not all of the important changes are going on inside the formal institutions of government, as described in the traditional textbook. One important nexus involves the connection between political campaigns and the press and political marketing. The electronic revolution of the last half century has had an extraordinary impact on American psychology generally, not just political psychology. The average American today watches 30 hours of television a week. The average American spends more time in front of the television set than at work, or will in another year or two. The average American child will have watched 19,000 hours of television before he or she graduates from high school. More time by far than in class or doing homework or playing on the playing fields or being with friends. For better or worse, my children and your children represent the first generation in history exposed to the extraordinary impact of visual communication. This is the first post-Gutenberg generation. This is the MTV generation. And I'm not now trying to make the kind of standard sneering analysis that someone who works or lives in 02138 makes about television. I'm making an empirical observation that the way people take in information and the way they respond is different if most of your life you've been taking in information visually than if most of your life you've been taking information in by reading it. And this dramatic development has revolutionized consumer marketing in this country, and it's revolutionized political marketing. Political marketing has attracted some extraordinarily talented people. It's made them very powerful. I'm thinking about the political consultants. One of the most important historically was a young man who, before he entered politics, was working in the Los Angeles office of J. Walter Thompson, the advertising firm, and he came from there to head a political campaign in 1968. This young man had made his name with a remarkably successful advertising campaign for an insecticide. Black flag kills bugs dead. 5 words. Redundant. It's not easy to be redundant in 5 words. Black flag kills bugs dead. And this person actually later on became famous for other reasons. Bob Haldeman. H.R. Haldeman took control. The secret of the advertising was keep it simple, repeat it a lot, and that's the advertising technique, the marketing techniques that have been. And it's not because it isn't. It's too simple to think this is somehow evil people. It's a response to the character of the marketplace. And there are other changes going on very, very rapidly. For example, because we are now increasingly, the market is increasingly a visual market, we're changing from words to images, visual images. I mean, for example, the advertisements for the Infinity automobiles, where the words almost never appear. The car doesn't appear. It's just the waterfall and the music or the sunset or the beach, and then infinity. That's what we're going to see in political. I mean, it's going to be sunset or sunrise. Smith. And, right, Smith. You want it? I knew you'd like Smith. And that's relatively issueless. Relatively issueless. Well, political advertising on TV has skyrocketed. In 1970, relatively recently, in 1970, in all of the congressional campaigns, $12 million was spent on TV ads. In last fall's congressional election campaigns, $270 million was spent on TV ads. I know there's been inflation over that period, but that, even if you deflate it, that's a huge increase. And ads are becoming, as I say, shorter and more visual. For example, as recently as 1984, just 6 years ago, only 5% of all ads were 15 seconds or less. In the 1990 campaign, 41% of all TV ads were 15 seconds or less. It's hard to have an elevated national debate in 15 seconds. But you can have the waving fields of grain or the waterfalls or whatever. And it's also not just the advertising, it's also the news coverage that's changing, statistically changing over this, as well as our experience is changing over this period. Kiku Adatu of the school's Shorenstein-Barone Center has recently published a very widely discussed study of national network news coverage, comparing the 1968 and the 1988 presidential campaigns. In 1968, she found that the average length of uninterrupted speech by a candidate aired by the networks, a so-called soundbite, the average length of a soundbite in 1968 was 42 seconds. Hardly enough time to carry on a sustained discussion, argument about a complex issue. And only 21% of the sound bites in 1968 lasted as long as a minute. In 1988, not a single sound bite in the whole campaign, not one, lasted as long as a minute. And the average block of uninterrupted speech dropped from 42 seconds to 9.8 seconds. Those last two sentences took me more than 9.8 seconds to read. It's very hard. We think of elections, or at least we thought of elections, as being a kind of a national deliberation in which we talked about the issues that were confronting the country, argued about them, thought about different ways of approaching them, and then resolved our disagreements by voting. That's not what elections are about now. You can't have a sustained deliberation, a sustained discussion in 9.8 second sound bites and with the waterfalls and sunsets. And once the political part in this traditional, this classical, almost now mythical image of election campaigns, what happened was you had this debate, and then you voted for a political party. And remember, in those days, one political party got the power. It got the presidency and the Congress. And then you held the political party accountable. People said what they were going to do, and then you could look and see if they did it. And if they did it and you liked it, you could vote for them. And if they didn't do it or you didn't like it, you could vote against them the next time around. But now, the main connecting rods between the electorate and the decision-making process are not political parties. They're TV, and they're pollsters, and they're people who run focus groups, and they're political consultants. And these are all very talented people. They're not morally suspect. They're not incompetent. But they're not elected. And they don't easily serve that function of a connecting rod between, they're not accountable. So we need to ask, is this part of the problem? Are these changes part of the problem in American democracy? And if so, what could be done about it? But you know, the new the new political marketing is effective in the end only because it appeals to us. And so the last kind of diagnosis that I want to talk with you about says, let's talk about us, not the government, not the officials, but us in our role as citizens. We have validated a conception of democracy in which public policy is not the outcome of a product of collective deliberation, but rather the residue of campaign strategy. We've forgotten an earlier conception of democracy, that described by Alexis de Tocqueville when he visited the United States in the 1830s. Tocqueville's vision of democracy emphasized the engagement of ordinary citizens in public affairs, a widely shared sense of civic obligation and of social solidarity. The organizational sinews of democracy, as de Tocqueville looked at the United States, were community associations, not electoral marketeers. Voting, however important it was only one small part of American democracy, as Tocqueville witnessed it. Increasingly today, I fear that we have a kind of shriveled and impoverished sense of citizenship in this country. And I believe that in order to rebuild and revitalize our democracy, we'll need to build from the bottom up. We need, in the phrase of the environmental movement, to think globally, but act locally. Act locally by building a more active, a more inclusive, a more diverse, a more responsible, and a more engaged civic culture. This year is the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, but I sometimes wonder whether we don't also need a Bill of Responsibilities that would focus our attention on our responsibilities as citizens, the obligations of citizenship. There's evidence that civic engagement actually does make a difference for the quality of government. There's evidence in the experience of communities all across this country that engagement by ordinary citizens in civic organizations, civic associations, can make a difference to the quality of government. You'll forgive me, I hope, if I use as my example some research that I've been working on in an other earlier life before I became dean of the Kennedy School. For the last 20 years, I've been doing some research on different local governments up and down the peninsula of Italy. Now, some of those local governments work pretty well. The officials answer the mail, they build daycare centers, they invest in roads, and some of them don't work at all. There's nobody there. When you go to the office to try to get a fellowship, there are no daycare centers built. You know in this country too, there are sometimes governments that work and others that don't work. Now the question is why? What explains why some governments work and some governments don't work? In the Italian case, distributed up and down the peninsula of Italy. Well, the communities of Italy are themselves very diverse. Some of them are governed by communists and have been for 50 years, and some of them are governed by Catholics and have the Christian Democrats and have been for 50 years. Some of them by liberals, conservatives. Some of the areas in Italy are as wealthy and economically advanced as any place on earth, and some of the areas of Italy are as backward as a third world. They look statistically like Nicaragua or Syria, that level of development. What accounts for the differences? What accounts for the differences between the places that government works and the places that it doesn't work? Well, it turns out not to be wealth. It's not how wealthy the region is that makes a difference. Economic prosperity. It's not what parties in political power. The best predictor is choral societies. Well, I mean choral societies and civic associations of all sorts, Rotary clubs and voting turnout in the sense of active engagement in local politics. Choral societies I use as the metaphor because it captures what it is about, statistically speaking, it's the degree to which there is active involvement in local associations. Areas where there is active involvement in Rotary societies or bird watching societies and choral societies and so on have better government, statistically controlling for everything else, than communities where there isn't that kind of active civic culture. Well, now, there are civic engagement, just as Tocqueville said, civic engagement does make a difference for the quality of government, and it can in this country too. I want to close with some remarks that were made by my favorite conservative George Will in an article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. The latest war, he said, has loosed an extraordinarily intense collective feeling from Americans. Clearly, this nation, though steeped in the severe individualism of the frontier notion of freedom, has a yearning for the community feeling that comes from collective undertakings. The question is whether any enterprise other than war can tap this feeling. Well, I believe that it is important that this school address questions of how to revitalize democracy. I believe that part of the problem may lie with the context of government, but a large part of the problem is likely to involve the character of our civic culture. At least this is one of the hypotheses we're working on. But I mean to end these remarks with a question. Will you help us engage in thinking about how to make where it's working, where it could be working better, American democracy, and how we can make it better? Thanks very much.
The Dean has agreed to take some questions, so if you'll step to the microphones, he'll be glad to field your questions.
Hello, my name is Allison Marie Johnson. I'm representing the student body here. I'm a co-chair of the student government, and I want to extend a very hearty welcome to all the alumni who have come to the school this weekend, and thank the Dean for bringing up a very important topic for us as students as well as alumni. And I think that much of what you are saying can be applied to what is going on here at the Kennedy School, and that every initiative that can be taken to make this school more democratic, to have more participation from students in the decisions that are made, and initiatives that are taken as an administration, could help this school become a model and a place to take and use and apply in other parts of the country. In other words, as a school of government, we could become a model for the rest of the university as well as the rest of the country of how real democratic principles should be applied and what popular participation and community input really means. And I would like to see the Dean as well as alumni support students in this initiative, because I feel that now is the time and there is a lot of student support for these ideas, and we would like to become a greater part of the school and a greater part of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add, this is almost sort of a joint question. I'm the other co-chair of the student government. And my name is Leonard Adler. And I think we really want to stress to the alumni and students and even the new students that are here visiting the school that this is really, I mean, I applaud you because you've really uncovered, I think, the fundamental problem here, I think, at the school and as you say, across the world. And that's really people's involvement in the decisions that concern them. And this is an issue that we ourselves have brought up to alumni and to various administrators. And I mean, and there's numerous examples. For example, you talk about the number of civic organizations. The committee structure here at the Kennedy School is pretty much devoid of true power among the students and administration for any kind of connection. You talk about sound bites and lack of connection. There really is no connection between the students and the administration. And when you talk about voter apathy, you sort of see that here too. There's a tension between near protest and then total apathy. And that's not good for the school, for the alumni, or for us. And I think we, as Allison said, we just want to be a bigger part, because I think that in order for you to accomplish your goal, which we support, and we have found a common issue, and that's democracy, I think that we really need to start here, because only if we really utilize the student energy and the alumni energy can you really accomplish your purpose. I truly applaud you for bringing this up, and so I hope that you can bring us with you and that we can work together to make this school a more democratic place.
Thanks very much, Leonard. This is as others will have gathered, this is a continuing discussion that the three of us have had, and as I have said as I've said to both of you, as we've discussed as recently as a couple of weeks ago, we intend that there be, and there in fact is meant to be now, student engagement in all of these committees that have that are deliberating on, for example, the curriculum and other things. So we've talked about this before, and I'm glad to have your thoughts.
Okay, and just to let you know that we'll be continuing this, is that we are working with the Alumni Council to come up with a specific plan of action to present to you on this. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Börje Lundgren. I'm a visiting scholar at HID. I'm Swedish, and I very much enjoyed your speech, and I thinking about Swedish democracy and how it ought to be revitalized. Most of your aspects are very relevant. However, there was one aspect I was somehow missing in your analysis, and that is the whole question of income distribution and equity. And because I find it very hard to think of an active citizen in the way you wanted to see him or her in a society which is becoming increasingly skewed. That's my question, if you'd like to comment on
I
that.
agree with that. I mean, I think if you look, as I recently have been looking at some public opinion polls on questions of trust in government, it's true that if you look over the period from roughly the 1950s to roughly the 1980s, trust in government and engagement with government is, you know, it's gone up sometimes and down sometimes, but it's generally down. That's the general trend. But that trend, particularly trend in trust in government, engagement, political engagement, is down much more sharply among the economically less well-off parts of our population than it is among the rest of the population. Relatively wealthy, white, middle-class and upper-class people are less trusting in government and less engaged than they were 30 years ago. But that trend downward is much greater among the minorities in this country and among, which largely overlaps with that, the lower social and economic income groups. So I think that there's no question there's a direct connection between the degree of social equity and the degree of political engagement. Yes.
Allison Hughes, Tucson, Arizona. I'd just like to make an observation about citizen engagement. The old model cities programs that I was involved in, I have seen from that emerge local leadership from minority communities, from poverty communities. People who have been involved in that program back in the early 70s have risen, certainly in Arizona, to positions of power on elected offices. I saw that program really, leaders emerge from that. There's certainly a new generation of people who are not involved in that. We've seen the old CETA program emerge with, again, citizen involvement, and that then moved into JTPA, moving away from direct citizen involvement from the poverty community, entering the small business community into memberships and JTPA committees at local levels. I think that one thing government can do is start to look at the incentives that programs like Model Cities produced back in the 70s for direct citizen involvement in government, because out of those emerged local leaders, and a new generation has occurred since then. So we need to start analyzing what happened from that.
I agree with that. I think that's a quite good point. I would only add that I don't think that the civic engagement, the engagement in community organizations that's necessary for effective democracy, needs to be only through the agency of government. That is to say, I think that engagement in all sorts of private and third sector, as it's sometimes called, associations, can be equally important for the creation of that kind of civic culture that I was talking about. And to some extent, really a hopeful sign is that the engagement in certain kinds of philanthropic organizations at the local level actually is up. And for example, I applaud the in a way theory that lies behind the 1,000 points of light that President Bush talked about. I think that's not just campaign rhetoric. I think I mean, maybe it also is campaign rhetoric, but it's the kind of thing that doesn't solve all problems, but can provide the kind of cultural fiber for effective problem solving, including government problem solving. Yes, Charlie.
Gene, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed that. I think you're on to a dynamic topic. This is the topic for the 21st century. I have a question and a paradox. The question is, what's the relationship between cynicism and this yearning for a collective action that you talk about? I think George Will's right, but people have learned not to have hope. So how do we connect that experience with Watergate and Vietnam and past disappointments with government and public effort with this yearning? How do you translate the cynicism and all that bad feeling into something positive? And the paradox is, about a month ago during the Gulf War, we had a group of elites, Kennedy